Thank you, Niels, and thank you everybody for coming today. It's a great pleasure and a great opportunity for me to be able to speak to all of you. I did warn a couple of people that we just got in yesterday, so if I look a little tired, then feel free to throw something at me or give me a gentle kick. I'll try to respond. I thought I would talk for a minute about the FBI because although Niels said everybody knows the FBI, we had a pre-meeting today and the comment was made about, well, the FBI is seen from all the media and on TV as the feds show up and tell everybody else what to do. So I thought I would talk a little bit about what the FBI actually is, just for a minute to set the stage, because that's really not who the FBI are, at least I hope. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of my thoughts about IT and digital transformation, which is a challenge that faces us and I think faces everybody here as well. And then we'll go over to the questions. And the only thing that I will say as a caveat, by the way, is no politics, please. I'm happy for everybody to ask questions on that if you want, but I really am not in a position to be able to talk about any of those issues. And it sounds like you'll have a group who's here in a couple of weeks or next month who is going to be better situated to talk about that. So the FBI is the premier law enforcement agency in the U.S. We have about 35,000 employees, another 20,000 or so contractors, task force officers and others associated. And the mission really is uphold the Constitution and protect the country. So that's a really broad thing. And that covers all sorts of investigative areas, literally thousands of different things that the FBI investigates. The obvious ones you all know about: counterterrorism, espionage, violent crime, but all sorts of smaller ones as well that are important to those individual constituents. We work healthcare fraud in conjunction with the Department of Health and Human Services. We work child pornography and innocent images cases. We work environmental crimes. It's a really wide breadth of things. And that's really one of the challenges for us as an organization because we're dispersed across the whole country. We have 56 field offices. And in each of those field offices, we have to be able to work on any one of those different violations. We have to have the skills and the abilities and the resources, regardless of whether you're in a big office like New York or in a really small office like Omaha, Nebraska, to be able to work any of those things, because unfortunately terrorism or espionage or child pornography can happen anywhere. And that means that each of those field offices, even though they operate as independent entities, need that ability to respond to everything. So you can imagine technology is really critical to the ability to do that, to share information, to collaborate, to work internally amongst ourselves, but also with our partners, because that's one of the other important things. The message from TV might be that we come in and we say we're the feds and everybody get out of the way, but the reality is we're critically dependent on state and local agencies as partners. There's more than 18,000 agencies that do the law enforcement mission in the United States. And that ranges from the New York Police Department, which has 30,000 plus sworn law enforcement officers who carry a gun and a badge and keep New York safe, to small little sheriff's departments or police departments who probably have 2 or 3 or 5 people and can't afford to make big investments in technology or virtually anything, to be honest. They are still driving the same police cars that they did from 10 or 15 years ago, and there's no way that they've got in that car any sort of modern technology, but they're also critical partners for us. So that's a really important part of the mission for us, is serving that entire law enforcement community, providing the expertise, the skills, the technical capability to support them, to share information with them, to collaborate with them across the board. On top of that, we're also one of the larger members of what we call in the U.S. the intelligence community. That's the agencies whose job it is to understand globally what's the picture of all the threats that face the United States. And there are a lot of agencies that have parts of that. They range from the State Department, which plays an important role in doing analysis of what's the threat situation in various countries, to the FBI, to the CIA, to the National Security Agency, and others. The FBI then is one of the most important and larger members of that intelligence community as well. And that means that we have a mission to collect intelligence for analytical purposes that's different from our law enforcement mission, where the role is ultimately, hopefully, to identify and arrest somebody that we can prosecute. On the intelligence side, that might lead to information that gets us to a prosecution, but that's not necessarily the objective. The objective there is to inform the intelligence community, to inform the U.S. government of what those threats are and how we as a country should be responding to those. So I just wanted to make it clear that the FBI has both of those roles. It is one of the challenges that we have of how do we keep those things partitioned, because our law and authorities for what we can do under the intelligence side of the mission are not the same as what we can do on the criminal side, the law enforcement side of the mission. So just a really quick example to illustrate what I mean by that. We have authorities that allow us to collect information on people who are tied to a foreign power. we can't use that information for prosecutorial purposes. There are two very different sets of laws. We have to be able to collect information for both that national security reason and also for criminal reasons, keep them separate. The law requires us to keep them separate and use them for their appropriate purposes, share those pieces of information with the right people. And it's a lot of information. We have hundreds of millions of billions of records in different places from different legal authorities that we collect. So that's sort of the landscape of the FBI. In terms of technology, as Neil said, we spend about $1.5 billion a year on IT in the organization. That's US dollars. Just to give you a sense of that, our total budget is somewhere between 8 and 9 billion US dollars. The biggest single chunk of that is on people, is on salaries and benefits for our employees. That's the most important asset of the FBI is our workforce. About half goes to that. The other half goes to everything else. That's buildings, that's technology, that's cars that agents drive, that's travel, everything else. So of that $4 billion, $1.5 billion goes to IT. So you can imagine the importance of technology to the mission in the organization. And sort of a good news, bad news story, that grows every year. The good news is that it grows every year and we recognize more and more the importance of that technology. But the bad news is our budget isn't growing every year. So we have to find ways to be more effective, and that covers a wide range of things, but it really comes down to transforming how we think about technology. It comes down to understanding where it makes sense for us to not build our own thing as we have traditionally done and as many organizations have traditionally done, but leverage relationships with partners in the government or with the private sector. And that transformation, then, that is fundamentally a very hard challenge for us. The technology is necessary to enable that, but it's not sufficient. So let me explain for a second what I mean by that. We all know that there's technologies out there, the cloud and everything else, which allow us to automate things. They allow us to standardize things. They allow us to commoditize products. Those are all good things from a technology standpoint, but we frequently don't think about what are the implications of that for the workforce. If we've changed the way that we buy something and standardize and focus on commodities for our IT, that means our procurement folks, who are not necessarily technologists, have to think and act differently. And that might mean changes in our policy. It might mean changes in federal regulations. It might mean changes in the law. The transformation is not going to be successful if all we do is deliver technology and don't think about how we incentivize all those other changes in procurement and security and legal processes and everything else that's necessary to affect that transformation. And that really comes down to, I think, how do we incentivize and create a value proposition for that transformation? There's really very little value to a security person say if we tell him or her, we're going to do something differently now, and you're going to have to think differently about how you do your job, and that's going to require a lot of work on your part, and what's the incentive for you? If all they do is sit there and think about it as, oh, hey, it's easy for me to say no now today when we have physical control over these things. And for a lot of you, if you've dealt with security folks, no is their first response, right? We can't keep doing that, though. That's part of what makes it complicated and expensive for us. So we have to find ways to be more efficient and effective. And the same thing goes for our procurement folks, and the same thing goes for our legal folks and for the users of technology as well. So we have to really think about how do we create a value proposition that makes it worthwhile for the entire workforce, for the entire organization to change and adopt to the new tools, to the new capabilities, to the new technologies. I don't want to pretend that there's a silver bullet. We're still working through a lot of these issues. We've made some strides, I think, where today we're further along than we were. And the evidence that I use for that is that whereas a few years ago, it was a very big challenge, that $1.5 billion spread across the entirety of the FBI. It was not all centralized in our enterprise IT. Today, more and more of the mission folks, the people who do counterterrorism and who do cyber investigations and who do other things, are coming to us and saying, we don't want to do our own thing anymore. We want to leverage the enterprise services that you all are making available so that we can focus on our mission critical thing, which is, in my mind, is success, right? We're not a company with a bottom line. We can't look at, well, we saved some money, we increase the P&L, but if we increase the mission success, if we increase the ability of our agent workforce, our analyst workforce, to work on the hard investigative problems that we bring them, that we hire them, that we train them to do, then that's success for us. And that's a hard thing to quantify because, again, there's not a bottom line, but that's the goal. The more time that Tim and his colleagues can spend out in the community engaging with folks who might have information that they can spend working on investigations, the more successful that we are in doing our jobs. So I think I'm going to shift over to the fireside chat now.
You mentioned the leadership component of transformation, and there's a element certainly I sort of see with agencies here in Australia around getting the cultural piece to be aligned with the technology spend and the like. Maybe a few more words about how you mastered, and I guess the challenges potentially on the way of getting the cultural piece right for a constituent of 30,000 or even 50 if you extend it more broadly.
Yeah, it's an important question, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that we've mastered it. We've at least though recognized, and leadership in the FBI beyond just IT folks think about the importance of technology to the mission today. And I think it has to start at that level. At the grassroots level, we have no problem. We have lots of really smart, innovative people. We hire agents and analysts to be smart and capable and assertive and aggressive and to do what they need to do. So the problem does not lie there. The problem is how do we get leadership focused and understanding the importance of technology and thinking about the risks and the impact to the organization every day. And so we've done a number of things to try to do that, to try to engage with all of them as stakeholders, to communicate with them, to incentivize them in positive ways, to have the director holding them accountable for the things that they do. He's done that explicitly. We have a single integrated FBI strategy. It contains a number of components. Traditionally for years, technology was not a critical part of it. It is today. So he's explicitly made improving information technology and encouraging innovation to be foundational parts of the FBI strategy. He holds me accountable for success on that ultimately, but that's clearly not about me. That's about the entirety of the FBI's leadership team understanding the importance of information technology, understanding the importance of innovation, and then there are other related components of that as well. Cybersecurity is on there explicitly as well, increasing our ability. And that for us is twofold. That means protecting ourselves, but a critical part of our mission is actually responding to U.S. companies who are victimized by cyber intrusions. So on both fronts, we have to be able to improve our capability from a technical standpoint. So the strategy of the FBI, the thing that the director uses to hold his leadership team accountable, now very explicitly reflects the importance of technology, the importance of transformation, the importance of thinking about those things.
We're going to come back to the measurement piece. I think that's a key question that I think would be on many people's minds, particularly if they're IT leaders, is how do you measure that?
Yep.
Before I go there and open up for more general questions, the question of shadow IT, right? I'd suggest there's not a public or private sector entity that doesn't have some degree of shadow IT. Often it's a reflection of the fact that maybe the centralised IT is not delivering. It's a reflection of the fact that we're experiencing an amazing amount of applications in our personal lives that we want to see inside the work environment. You talked about bringing those shadow IT teams back internally. You talked about the financial lever. Just other levers about how you manage to balance the desire for centralised control, but also reflecting that shadow IT can bring innovation.
Absolutely. So the first thing I would say about that, Aidan, is I personally do not like the name shadow IT because it has, in my mind, a pejorative connotation. It's a bad thing that somebody went off and did innovation. My experience is 90 or 95, if not 100% of the time, it is somebody who feels like they didn't get good service from the core
Gordon,
enterprise.
what should we call it?
Mission-focused IT is what I try to use because I think that really does reflect, in our case, that's the culture of the organization. Like I said, our agents, our analysts, they are the culture and what we want out of them, what we train them to do, what we expect out of them is do what you need to do to get the job done. You have to comply with the law, but your goal ultimately is to prevent bad things from happening or to put bad guys in jail. And if that means that we couldn't provide technology to help you, they're going to go and do it themselves. I mentioned we have 56 field offices. Each of those field offices is to some degree a kingdom in its own right. They have their own budget, their own resources, and they have some degree of control over the ability to do things. And I want to encourage that because there is a lot of great capability out there. But what they don't think about and why it's important to have some levers to bring them back is there's a whole bunch of other requirements on that information technology. There's laws that require us to manage records. And that sounds very mundane, but it's a critically important thing for us. So what I mean by that is when we go to trial, when somebody has been indicted and goes to trial, the law requires us to disclose all the information related to that, to the defense, to the defendant. We've, over the years, had a number of cases that had a bad outcome, either an appeal overturned a conviction or it was delayed or even outright the trial was dropped because we were unable to deliver all the relevant information to the defense. And so that's a really bad outcome for us if a known bad person doesn't go to jail, doesn't get the sentence that they should have. And you know, a really high-profile example of that, Timothy McVeigh, who some of you might know was the Oklahoma City bomber, the largest domestic terrorism act in the United States. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was not carried out for many years after that because the FBI couldn't find all the records and turn them over to his lawyers. And that resulted in many, many years of appeals at great personal cost, at great cost to the country. So when the mission does their thing, they don't think about that. And so that's a problem. And there are other things maybe less important than that, but also similarly affect, you know, speed allows us to ignore those things. So security, though, is the obvious other important one, right? When that individual field office builds their own solution, they're thinking about what do they need to do the job. They're not thinking about how do I secure this data to make sure that it's controlled, that it's in the right place, that the right people can access it, but nobody else. So we have to balance the speed and the innovation and the need to do what we need for the mission with how do we meet those security requirements, those records requirements, the other legal requirements that are incumbent on us. We're trying to take both a carrot and a stick approach. We have various cloud solutions available to us today, and what we want to do is incentivize people to use those. Don't go build and buy your own technology and maintain it yourself. Here's a solution that comes with all of that for you. And on top of that, it has the security controls in place. And on top of that, it has the records management controls in place. And oh, by the way, if you only want to do more than less than a certain threshold, we'll pay for it for you. We won't even make you invest in it yourself. If you're going to use cloud services and it's going to cost you a few hundred or a few $1,000s, as a lot of these small projects do, we'll cover it. We'll pay for it for you. So hopefully we incentivize people to come and use these core enterprise tools and capabilities that it incentivizes them. But oh, by the way, it has the benefit for us of we have security visibility into what they're doing, and we can ensure that they're maintaining their systems appropriately, and we can ensure that logging and auditing and all the things that we need to do from a security standpoint are done compliant with our enterprise standards.
Yeah, I have to say it's quite refreshing when I often speak to CIOs, Gordon. It often is a very technical conversation they end up having, but you know, the fact that you're constantly turning it back to what does it mean and why should the end user play ball.
So that's an important cultural piece, and I think of the FBI, and I've learned this the hard way. I can go and have an incredibly technical conversation with my boss or with other executives, and it means nothing to them because their entire focus is on the outcome to the mission. That's the culture of the organization, and I've had to learn how to frame my arguments and my discussions and my analysis into that, right? What's the, not bottom line for us again, but what's the outcome? How many more investigations are we going to be able to be involved in? How many more prosecutions can we do? Because the unfortunate truth of the matter is there is an unlimited supply of that out there in the world, right? There are cases, you know, on the national security side, on the counterterrorism side, we work every complaint that comes in. But on the criminal side, we don't have the resources. We don't have the ability. There's just far too many. And we make a prioritization decision. If it's a financial fraud case and it's below a certain dollar threshold, we're going to refer it to somebody else, to the SEC or to a local agency, because we just don't have the resources, even though we have the authority. The more of that I can help our mission folks do and be engaged with, that's my measure of success. That's success for us from a technology standpoint, is enabling that.
Yeah. Let me open it up to the floor for a question down the back. Thank you, Katie.
I did warn Gordon of this question before.
Maybe just introduce yourself as well.
Paul Italiano, Chief Executive of Transgrid, the transmission system operator in New South Wales, the ACT. Just before we get on to that, I would say mission-focused IT abbreviates to MISFIT. My IT guys in the room are sure to remember. I'm interested in your comment about the FBI having, as part of its remit, the role of working with private sector companies to help them with cybersecurity threats. It's not the experience I have in Australia. We've not been approached with any offers of assistance from any agencies that I'm aware of. In your experience, have you witnessed a difference in philosophy between Australian security agencies and the US, and why the FBI has been given the responsibility of working with companies?
I'm going to plead ignorance on the Australian side because I don't know that I have that much awareness of the Australian security agencies and how they handle cybersecurity. I will talk a little bit about it from the U.S. perspective. There are a number of things that our cyber division does which are explicitly focused on building relationships and engaging. And the message from them definitely is we want a relationship with you now. Don't wait until after an incident happens and then come to us asking for help. We'll help as best we can, but the more we're proactively engaged, the more that we're sharing information, the more that we're helping you, the better that is for everybody. I mean, the unfortunate reality, which I think a lot of you know here, is everybody is a target in one way or another these days. It's too late to react after the incident, right? So engage, be forward-leaning. We want that opportunity. We provide those tools. Tim here can certainly collaborate with you, can point you to folks we have down in Canberra. One of Tim's colleagues who is focused on cybersecurity, and that is his mission. That's why he's here in Australia. And I'm sure they would be happy to talk to you about some of the things that we do to try to work with the private sector. And there's a variety of things that we do to do explicitly that.
One of the things that's often called out, just sort of extending from that question, is the security fraternity and to a lesser degree the law enforcement agencies have grown up in a culture that's for decades, if not centuries, about keeping their secrets as close as possible.
Yep.
And of course, as we now enter the cyber world, this is now all about how do we work together, in part because the internet is owned heavily by the private sector, the businesses like Transgrid, from time to time may be the victims. Given that you are one of those intelligence agencies, and as the CIO, how are you turning your agency inside out so that they're less about keeping the secrets, but more actually sharing appropriately?
Yeah. There isn't any one single thing in many cases to answer a question like that, but in the case of the FBI, I think that there actually is to a great degree, which is 9/11. Right? 9/11 had a very transformative effect on the FBI, and we've referred to it internally as the burning platform. It was the thing that motivated the FBI as an agency to realize that the ways that it did things had to change if we were going to address the threats of the new world. That's covered a wide range of things over the years, but at its core, one of the most foundational things there was we had to get out of the silos and stovepipes of information and into a more collaborative environment. We had information about a number of the 9/11 terrorists, and you can look at many other high-profile incidents that have happened over the years. The information's there. That's not the problem. The problem is, what do you do with it? How are you using the tools that you have and the information you have and collaborating with partners who might also have information that they see and understand those issues and know how to address them as well? That certainly is not an easy thing. I would be kidding you and myself if I thought we had solved that problem. But we clearly, after 9/11, that was a very transformative event for us for many obvious reasons. But a key focus of that was the expectation is you will share information. The culture before 9/11 was definitely we'll share information if you have a need to know, and only if you have a need to know. There are probably still a few pockets in the FBI where that's the case. For I think obvious reasons, I didn't mention, but one of our areas that we have unique investigative authorities is public corruption. So is that congressman or that representative or that local representative is he or she doing something they shouldn't be doing? That by its nature is an incredibly sensitive thing, and we don't want to share that information broadly. But outside of those few type of exceptional circumstances where there are reasons to restrict information, the mantra is definitely to share, and we build tools and create processes and create joint organizations where we collaborate with our colleagues both at the federal and state and local levels explicitly for the purpose of sharing information. Yeah. And that is absolutely the expectation, and from leadership on down, the way we train and communicate and build now is to figure out how we can share.
And yet you've got, I guess, the context where all the various agencies have been created through typically statutes of law that are built in the physical world, now trying to apply it to the virtual world where there are no boundaries, and just mastering that new dimension.
Yeah, there's definitely not an easy answer to that today. We and our colleague agencies are certainly struggling with, there was this clear partition once upon a time of whose responsibilities lay where, and now the technology has moved well ahead of the law and well ahead of the regulations and well ahead of whatever original justification there was for that particular organization and structure and dynamic. And we're all trying to respond and figure out how to do better at that. As an example of that in the technology arena, once upon a time, if we wanted to get data from another agency, so I'll pick on the State Department here. So we get information from the State Department. When you fill out the I-94, that's the U.S. form, right, that you fill out when you come into the country and show your visa status and where are you going to be. We, in order to do that, signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the State Department that said we can get that data and we can put it into this physical system which sits over here in this location and can be accessed by these people for this purpose. And that's it. And we multiply that by hundreds or thousands for other relationships we have with other agencies and other sources of data, which we have the lawful authority to use for investigative purposes, and I think there's an obvious reason, but each one of those required a separate agreement. We're now trying to go a step back and say it doesn't make sense to have these hundreds or thousands of point-to-point agreements to come up with a more general way of collaborating and sharing information that covers all of those and says if we put this information in the cloud and we do the right things to control it and make sure the right people access it and do the lawful things with it, we don't need all these individual agreements anymore.
Yeah.
That requires not only us changing, but all these other agencies changing as well.
Yeah. And certainly in our markets, that data jurisdiction piece is top of mind. There's a real question about sort of the long arm of overseas or foreign governments reaching into whether it's accessing data in Australia or even a third country, and just how does that get managed when data doesn't reside in the jurisdiction of the agency that's trying to access it?
Yep.
Questions from the floor?
Sorry, Peter Jones from Macquarie, that does kind of relate to that last question. You mentioned that you collaborate with 18,000 agencies. That's quite extraordinary, from the Dukes of Hazzard in Hazzard County, presumably, through to the New York Police Department with 30,000 people. That must be quite extraordinary, the data structures to enable that level of collaboration. Is that something you could talk a little bit about, and some of the examples that have worked well for the agency in terms of mission focus?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be clear, the New York Police Department is actually a lot bigger than 30,000. It's 30,000 police officers, probably times 2 or times 3 when you add in all the people who are associated to enable those folks to do their jobs. It's interesting to me, TV obviously is a theme here, right? Dukes of Hazzard and what other old American TV shows do you guys watch? I-50, yeah. The old one or the new one? So we have an entire division called the Criminal Justice Information Services Division, who was built explicitly for the purpose of information sharing with all these partner agencies. They have half a dozen very large, very complex systems and a very big and unfortunately complicated and slow-moving bureaucratic process around that, because what we can't do is levy a new requirement that will force 18,000 agencies, many of which, like I said, are very small and don't have much of a budget, to change the ways they do things in order to be able to share and access that information. So there is a fairly complex governance process that's been built where changes are proposed, validated by the boards that do that. That typically, unfortunately, takes a couple years to get all the way through it and get to the point of implementing changes in those systems. So I would like to find ways for us to move that a lot faster and to use technology to help move some of those things faster, but that is a challenge. Nevertheless, we have a number of these very large systems. They're built explicitly with the idea that they are the platforms to share and allow collaboration with law enforcement partners. They're serviced by a set of common services that allow us to try to work with each of those agencies to say, you tell us who the lawful people are in your agency who should be authenticated to come in and use this information. That's proving to be very challenging because every agency has their own processes for vetting their people, for securing them, for controlling them when they change jobs or leave the agency. All those things are very, very challenging and create some risk to us. But on the other hand, those are the agencies that are most in need of help because it's a small little agency. They really are critically dependent on the FBI when there's a big incident in one of those jurisdictions. And so we want to find ways to bring them into the fold and feel like they are an active participant and have the ability to reach back and get help when they need it. So the focus is then on working with those agencies through those processes to say, what are the tools that you guys need that will help your line police officers do their jobs better?
Great. Another question from the floor.
Hi, Patrick Fair from collaboration with agencies within the US. The Australian government is currently undertaking a consultation regarding our international posture, having just appointed a cyber ambassador. And I wondered, what you would say are the items of low-hanging fruit which would improve cooperation between somebody like the FBI and international agencies to help improve cybersecurity, particularly with so many threats coming from offshore.
My general sense, and certainly nothing is perfect, but my general sense is, at least between the U.S. and Australia, cooperation in the cyber arena and the information security arena and the law enforcement arena is pretty good. That there's a relatively open flow of information as necessary. But I know we provide a lot of information back to Australian agencies as we identify it, and I know that the flow comes in the other direction as well. That as folks here identify threats, issues, problems, that information flows well. The challenge gets into there are different data governance laws and standards and regimes in every country, and it's very complex to match up Australian law and Australian expectations with the U.S. And then when you add in, typically what happens there is it's not bilateral. We try to do it in collaboration with what's called the Five Eyes, which includes New Zealand and the UK and Canada as well. I think it's an exponential problem, right? It's not the five, it's 2 to the 5th or something like that, different arrangements and different policy regimes that need to be worked out, because even though we all have similar intentions in mind, everybody's laws are different. The actual authorities of each agency are different, and figuring out how to map those is a hard thing. There's active work going on trying to figure out how to do that and improve it and use technology to help. But I don't think it's a lack of will or a lack of desire to share. It's working through a lot of those issues, and we get into a lot of national provenance, kind of like you talked about, Aidan, about, well, if the data are here in Australia, what authority does Australia have? What authority does Australia have to share it with the other Five Eyes partners, and vice versa? So all of those things, the lawyers and the politicians will have to work that out. But there's definitely a will to do that.
I'd add probably, Patrick, I think one of the real challenges is, and I was over in DC as part of the Australia-US cybersecurity dialogue with our Prime Minister late last year, and the real challenge is how do the two nations work together to help us in this region, right? Regardless of where our ability to communicate between the two nations are, it's how do we secure the region, and we have a very crucial role in helping the US and ourselves secure our friends to the north.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please, down the back.
Paul McLaughlin from McCullough Robertson Lawyers. You talk to any IT security professional and they say that humans are the weak link in any security system. I'm hoping you'll say no, but is the FBI any different? I mean, are you worried about agents sticking thumb drives in their laptops and sending their information to their Hotmail accounts?
Well, shame on any agent who still has a Hotmail account, right? But humans,
Private server?
or private, yeah. Humans are the weak link in any of these, right? The technology, like I said before, on the general sense of transformation is necessary, but it's not sufficient. There are always things that people have to do to behave in a secure, reliable way. We try to minimize the risks and the opportunities to do silly things, but it's impossible. The regime would be so restrictive that nobody would get any work done if we had every single possible avenue blocked by policy and by technology. I don't think that that's a cost-effective solution. We have to train our workforce and rely on them doing the right things. We have to monitor them. We have to audit them. The FBI is like every other agency in that regard. And I would actually say our problems are more complex than in a lot of ways. We operate on multiple levels of classification. We have an unclassified network, which we use to communicate with our partners and collaborate and share information. We have classified internal networks that we use for more sensitive and restricted data. So we have to figure out how to manage information back and forth across all of those as well. And that introduces more opportunities for people to do silly things.
Down the front here, thank you.
Fred Chilton. My question relates to the use of artificial intelligence and data analytics. And to what extent is that changing the nature of your workforce? Mm-hmm. And are you able to cut down on the cost because you need less employees and you can use the Watsons of this world to troll through all that myriad of information you have to come up with solutions more quickly?
Yep. So artificial intelligence itself is a I'm sorry, in case anybody couldn't hear that because there wasn't a mic. It was a question about what's the impact of artificial intelligence on the mission and on our ability to be more efficient and more effective. Artificial intelligence is a broad term which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. We are certainly looking at how we can take advantage of advanced analytic capabilities to try to help us look through all the volumes of data we have and see patterns, and you can probably imagine a lot of different scenarios where that would be really beneficial to us. At the same time, as a law enforcement agency whose goal ultimately is to be able to present evidence at trial, that raises some real questions for us about how do we use that technology. Today, an agent goes and testifies in front of a judge before a jury, we did these things, and here's how I know that we had this evidence in our control the entire time, or how we got to this conclusion that this person was responsible for this thing. If the answer to that question is, Watson told us, what does that mean from a legal standpoint? It's an open area. The technology in many cases is ahead of the law. This is one of those where that's the case. We have to figure out how do we take advantage of those technologies because they're there and the benefit is potentially huge. But we have to understand how we want to use them as well. And so it's not just going to be, well, we will stop all the other things that we do for data collection and analysis and replace them with an AI machine that will just spit out answers to us. So it's, I'll just leave it to say, it's an area of ongoing interest and investigation.
Other questions from the floor? Down the middle, thank you.
Hello, Gordon. My name is Federico Bettini. I work for a cybersecurity company. In the past, I was a procurement director for a large organization, and I've experienced that some small vendors with very smart technologies couldn't approach a large organization because of the speed to market and because of the governance and all these processes. So are you experiencing the same in the FBI? And if yes, how are you trying to solve it? Thank you.
So I think in government in general, at least in the U.S., there are a number of barriers to speed to acquiring and deploying technologies or really anything, and that's an unfortunate reality of being in government is that we have something called the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. It's fill up that bookcase in the back with a bunch of volumes of very obscure regulations, and that's the FAR. So we have to figure out how to deal with that, and we're trying to do a number of things, not just us, but the U.S. government in general, to allow micro purchases and micro procurements and to do agile procurement and to do things like code challenges to test technology solutions and pick them that way. So we get people out of you've got to write a 5,000-page document to justify the business and have a procurement executive make the decision, but have the technologist actually make the decision based on sample products that are delivered by the companies. Hopefully that opens up the door. Today, though, the U.S. government does put a lot of burden on small companies, on companies of all sizes, to comply with U.S. procurement requirements. So the answer is yes, we're trying to do things. There's limits to what we can do, unfortunately.
The US has a presidential nominated federal CIO, so nominated by the president. In fact, we had the very first one, Vivek Kundra, here doing a fireside chat probably about 10 years ago. Yep. You haven't mentioned that position. Maybe just sort of talk a bit more, if you may, Gordon, about what is the role of a centralised CIO in this cyber landscape?
Yeah, so we had Tony Scott, who with the transition left, and the last I know it hasn't been replaced yet. So there's an opportunity for somebody here who's interested in the job.
Do you need to be an American citizen?
Probably. For the right candidate, they might be willing to make some exceptions.
An executive order to overcome
anything's possible, right? So that is a challenging position, right? That role is somebody who can be an advocate and who can shine a spotlight on things, but the way it's constituted today doesn't have that much direct authority, unfortunately. It doesn't have the ability to control individual agencies' budgets or to make overall procurement or investment decisions for the whole of the government. They can make recommendations and they can shine a spotlight, and transparency sometimes will shame people into doing things or encourage people to continue doing the right things. But it's a very, very hard job, and the way it's constituted today, I think they've struggled to be effective, to just be frank.
The Australian government's sort of working through exactly what our equivalent of that, and not necessarily in one individual. Your advice as the Australian government thinks this through for this role?
My advice is they need to decide, is it just an evangelist role and something that you just want somebody who's out there highlighting issues and communicating them, or is it somebody that you really want to empower to affect change? If it's somebody you want to empower to affect change, you have to give them some tools to do that. And I'm not sure exactly what that would be to be successful here in Australia, but there could be a range of things from budget and oversight that could enable that person to be effective. The flip side is that imposes extra bureaucracy and has the potential to slow things down and make things more complicated. And certainly in the US, there would be significant resistance to that, right? I already have enough compliance and oversight coming from various directions today. If we were to add yet another layer to that, that gets away from the points that I was making before about agility and transformation and getting people to do things differently.
Thank you. One or two more questions, then we'll call time. Or are we calling time?
No.
No? Yeah.
So going back to the 56 field offices and the innovation process within the FBI, I'm curious, there must be some examples where someone out there has done something and you, as the central authority, have observed that and said, that's a really good idea. How do we take that idea and generalize it across the organization?
Yep.
What's the experience with that sort of thing?
The experience is that traditionally that happened in an ad hoc way where there were individual good things that happened, and if the right person at headquarters happened to know about it, then it would get bubbled up and become more of a wide-ranging tool for the enterprise. But it was really very much of an ad hoc, do we happen to have the right point-to-point connection between people? We're in the process of standing up a technology incubator office whose role it is to do exactly that. We've done a few small-scale outreaches so far to solicit those type of ideas, and then we're trying to shepherd them through in order to take that good idea from that individual office and look at making it be a broader enterprise thing. So let me give you an example of that. The process today when an agent goes to serve a search warrant and collect evidence is very manual. They have to. But critically important, right? The chain of custody of evidence, once it's collected, is essential to being able to use it and introduce it in a trial. We don't use technology at all in that. The evidence is labeled manually, and then it comes back with a barcode on it, and somebody manually takes that barcode and puts it into the evidence management system and logs it manually in wherever it is in the evidence control room in the field office. So there's lots of opportunities to make it, it's much more complicated than it needs to be. One of the ideas that came in was somebody who said, hey, we all have these cool things called smartphones now. Why don't we just use those? And so we actually have a pilot now where we have an application on our smartphones, which all of our agents have, to scan devices locally when evidence is identified, to take a picture of it, to apply the bar tag to it right there on the spot, and then to automate the collection of that information back up into our case management system. So sounds like a no-brainer. Actually getting it to work and meet all of our evidence requirements, it takes some work, but it's an example of the sort of thing that we're trying to do, where we're trying to get mission folks, users, agents, and analysts to say, what are the problems that you have where technology can actually help, and then to do exactly what I said, to incubate those, to work with stakeholders in all parts of the organization to take that thing and deploy it then more broadly to the enterprise.
So for your new incubator, is there any kind of private sector model or example that you've been inspired by?
We have done outreach to a bunch of private sector and government technology incubators to try to figure out some best practices. So there are some U.S. agencies that specialize on that for technology development, and we've worked with them. We've also engaged with a lot of private sector entities as well. It's an area I think it's fair to say everybody struggles with that. And so we've learned lots of good lessons. We've learned lots of, hey, don't do that because it might not work as well.
I mean, it's interesting because the Australian government's obviously going through a parallel journey, and the main centre for cyber here is the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. It's a multi-agency centre that just brings all the different remits together, and they've really struggled to work out how do they open up such a centre. And while Macquarie Telecom's was invited to sit inside that centre some time ago, how do you go beyond a very small number?
Yep.
to tap into what is a very deep set of intel that can really help in the cybersecurity stature. Final question from the floor. Thank you.
Yep. Rory Tyler from Commonwealth Bank. I know you wanted to steer away from politics. Quick question though. Trump has delayed signing the executive order on cybersecurity as an organisational change thing. How can an organisation your size pivot should some sort of change come through whereby you need to move the whole organisation away from that being your remit?
So let me just answer in the more abstract. The FBI is not a small organization. That's absolutely right. One of the focal points for us, and more broadly, when I mentioned the strategy that we have now, is to become a more agile organization in general. And we are slowly doing that. It's not easy by any means, but we do encourage that more now. The idea of when we respond to particular threats and issues, we don't necessarily do the way we traditionally would have done them, which was just a mass of agents descend upon that particular problem, but we do look to the collaborative joint groups and joint organizations and interagency teams. So that model is much more inculcated into the FBI today than it used to be, and I think it would be around one of those things where we would pivot. We have in the cyber arena relationships with all the other key stakeholders in the process, so regardless of whatever the final direction is, we're not starting from ground zero. We have those relationships. We have a fairly clear understanding of roles and responsibilities, although honestly, that is a challenge just because the threat changes all the time.
Let me, thank you very much. Let me sort of conclude by saying, Gordon, thank you for joining us today. I have to say, what you're doing as the CIO of FBI about engaging not only with industry, but across borders is what we need to do more in the cybersecurity fraternity, because that's the only way, in my personal view, we're ever going to raise that cybersecurity stature. So thank you for joining us down in Australia.
Great, thank you again for having me.